You're dying, Vincent. The doctors give you 6 months, maybe less. Vincent Caruso sat in the leather chair of his private office, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. But the terminal diagnosis wasn't real. It was a performance, a carefully orchestrated lie designed to flush out the snakes hiding in his empire. At 63, Vincent had built the Caruso family into one of New York's most feared organizations, controlling everything from the docks of Red Hook to the construction sites in Queens. Now, after whispers of disloyalty reached his ears through trusted sources, he needed to know who among his inner circle would move against him when they thought he was weak. Marco Benedetti, his underboss for 15 years, sat across from him with what appeared to be genuine concern etched on his face. "Boss, we'll get you the best treatment, whatever you need." Vincent watched Marco's eyes, searching for the flicker of calculation, the brief flash of opportunity that betrays a man's true intentions. He saw nothing yet, but the performance had only just begun. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, drop a comment and let me know where you're from. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story is going to take some unexpected turns. The next morning, Vincent's condition became the talk of every social club, restaurant and betting parlor under Caruso control. His consigliere, Tommy Russo, spread the word with calculated precision. Cancer, aggressive, the old man had months at best. Vincent played his part perfectly, moving slower, his voice softer, occasionally gripping the edge of tables as if fighting waves of pain. The performance was so convincing that even his own wife, Elena, who knew nothing of the deception, began making funeral arrangements in her mind. Within 48 hours, the vultures began circling. Vincent watched from his bedroom window as cars arrived at Marco's house in Bay Ridge, late-night meetings that Marco thought were invisible. Phone conversations were suddenly cut short when Vincent entered rooms. The respect in people's eyes began shifting, morphing into something that looked dangerously close to pity, mixed with ambition. "Boss, you should rest more," Marco said during their weekly meeting at Lombardi's, a restaurant Vincent's father had used for business since the 1960s. "Let me handle the union negotiations. You don't need the stress." Vincent nodded weakly, noting how Marco's suggestion meant taking control of their most lucrative operation, the construction unions that generated millions in kickbacks annually. "Maybe you're right, Marco. I trust you to handle it." The words tasted like ash, but they were necessary. Trust was the bait, and Marco was slowly taking it. Tony Messina, Vincent's driver and bodyguard for 20 years, was the first to express his concerns privately. "Something ain't right, boss. Marco's been meeting with the Colombo family 3 times this week." Vincent absorbed this information while pretending to struggle with his medication. The Colombos were rivals who'd been trying to edge into Caruso territory for years. If Marco was meeting with them, the betrayal ran deeper than simple ambition. It was a potential coup backed by outside muscle. "Keep watching," Vincent whispered, "but don't let anyone know you're reporting to me. As far as everyone knows, I'm barely holding on." The deception took its toll in unexpected ways. Elena stopped sleeping, her eyes hollow with grief for a husband who wasn't actually dying. His daughter, Isabella, flew in from California, her successful career as an attorney abandoned to spend time with her dying father. The guilt of lying to them gnawed at Vincent's conscience, but he'd built his empire on hard choices, and this was simply another one. 3 weeks into the charade, Vincent called a family meeting at his estate in Long Island. The sprawling property, with its manicured lawns and 12-foot walls, had been his fortress for 30 years. He gathered his captains, Marco, Tommy Russo, Sal Giordano, who ran their gambling operations, and Frank DeLuca, who controlled their waterfront businesses. These were men he'd broken bread with, men whose children called him uncle, men he'd made wealthy beyond their grandparents' wildest dreams. I need to start thinking about the future, Vincent said, his voice deliberately weak as they sat around his dining room table. The October rain pelted against the windows, creating a backdrop of natural melancholy. About who will lead after I'm gone. Marco leaned forward, his expression carefully composed into sympathy. Boss, you don't need to think about that now. You're going to beat this. Bill, but Vincent saw it. The hunger in Marco's eyes, the way his fingers drummed against the table with barely contained anticipation. The other captains remained silent, their gazes shifting between Vincent and Marco like spectators at a tennis match who knew the outcome before it was played. Marco, you've been loyal, Vincent continued, watching his underboss carefully. 15 years, you've never given me reason to doubt you. Maybe it's time. The dining room door burst open. Tony Messina stood there, his face pale, holding a briefcase. Boss, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this can't wait. Vincent had planned this moment carefully. Tony placed the briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing surveillance photos, wire transcripts, and bank records. Each document told a story of betrayal. Marco meeting with Colombo family representatives, accounts in the Cayman Islands where he'd been siphoning money, plans to eliminate Vincent once he was weak enough and take over with Colombo backing. The room froze. Marco's face went from carefully composed sympathy to pure shock to calculated rage in the span of 3 seconds. The other captains pushed back from the table, their chairs scraping against the hardwood floor as they positioned themselves away from Marco. You piece of shit, Marco hissed, not at Vincent, but at Tony. You've been spying? Vincent stood up, not weakly, not like a dying man, but with the full strength of a predator who'd been waiting for this moment. The dying mobster was suddenly very much alive, his eyes blazing with cold fury. 15 years, Marco. 15 years I treated you like a son. Vincent's voice was steady now, all traces of weakness vanished. I made you rich. I gave you power. And you couldn't wait 6 months for me to actually die. Marco's hand moved toward his waistband, where Vincent knew he kept a pistol. But Sal and Frank were faster, their own weapons already drawn and pointed at the underboss. Tony stepped forward, his gun trained on Marco's head. Don't, Vincent commanded, his hand raised. Not in my home. Elena's upstairs. The calculation that passed through Marco's eyes was visible to everyone in the room. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and his betrayal was laid bare on the table in black and white evidence. His shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining out of him as reality set in. You were never sick, Marco said, his voice hollow with the realization of how completely he'd been played. Cancer is a terrible lie, Vincent replied, almost as terrible as betrayal. But at least cancer is honest about wanting to kill you. Tommy Russo, the consigliere who'd remained silent throughout, finally spoke. Vincent, what do you want to do? It was the question that defined a boss, not just what happened to traitors, but how justice was dispensed. Vincent looked at Marco, seeing not just the traitor, but the man he'd once trusted, the godfather to his grandson, the person who'd sat at his table for hundreds of meals. Marco, you got 24 hours to get your affairs in order, Vincent said quietly. Take your immediate family, your wife, your kids, and disappear. Go somewhere we'll never find you, but you leave with nothing except your life. The money you stole goes back to the family. The territories you thought you'd control stay ours. And if I ever hear your name again, if you ever contact anyone in this organization, if you ever step foot in New York, New Jersey, or any city where we operate, you're done. No trial, no conversation, just done. Marco stared at him, processing the mercy within the sentence. Death was expected for this level of betrayal. Being allowed to walk away, even stripped of everything, was a gift he hadn't earned, but was being given nonetheless. Why? Marco asked, his voice cracking. Why let me live? Vincent sat back down, suddenly looking every bit his 63 years. The performance was over, but the weight of it remained. Because your son is 8 years old, Marco, and I remember what it's like to grow up without a father. Because your wife is innocent in this. Because despite everything, there's a part of me that remembers the man you were before greed poisoned you. He paused, letting the words settle. But mostly because I want you to live knowing you threw away everything over cowardice and impatience. Death would be too easy. Living with what you've lost, that's the real punishment. Tony escorted Marco out, the disgraced underboss walking like a man in a trance. The remaining captains sat in stunned silence, processing everything they'd witnessed. Vincent poured himself a scotch, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The Colombo family, Vincent said to the room. They thought they could use Marco to weaken us. Tommy, I want you to reach out to their boss. Tell him we have evidence of their involvement in an attempted coup. Tell him I'm willing to forget it happened, this one time. But they need to back off our territories permanently. Make sure they understand this isn't a negotiation. Tommy nodded. And if they refuse, then we remind them why the Caruso family has survived this long. But I'm hoping they're smart enough to take the out I'm offering. Sal Giordano cleared his throat. Boss, with respect, the family's going to want to know what happens next. Marco was your underboss. People are going to be nervous, wondering who you trust. Vincent looked at his remaining captains, men who'd proven their loyalty by not joining Marco's scheme, men who'd built their own small empires within his larger one through legitimate skill and dedication. What happens next is we get back to business. Marco thought I was weak, thought I was dying. He wasn't the only one. We're going to show everyone that the Caruso family is stronger than any one man, even me. He stood up, commanding the room. From now on, we operate differently. No more single underboss with access to everything. You three will form a committee that reports directly to me. Tommy handles legal and political connections. Sal manages the gambling and collections. Frank controls the waterfront and unions. Each of you is accountable for your territory, and each of you watches the others. Trust, but verify. Frank DeLuca, who'd been quiet throughout, finally spoke. That's smart, boss. Checks and balances. It's necessary, Vincent corrected. I trusted Marco completely, and look where that got us. The old ways of doing things, one boss, one underboss, they worked when honor meant something, but times have changed. We adapt, or we die. The meeting dissolved, and Vincent found himself alone in his study, the weight of the evening settling over him like a heavy coat. Through the window, he could see the lights of New York City in the distance, the empire he'd built glowing against the night sky. The performance was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Elena appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from crying. She'd been told about the deception, about the fake illness and the real betrayal. Her expression was a mixture of relief and anger. You let me think you were dying, she said, her voice barely controlled. I planned your funeral, Vincent. I called Isabella home from California. I spent 3 weeks grieving a man who was perfectly healthy. Vincent had no defense, no justification that would make it right. I needed to know who I could trust. The whispers had been going on for months. If I'd acted without proof, without seeing how people would behave when they thought I was weak, I might have gone after innocent people or missed the real traitors. And Marco, Eleanor asked, you're really letting him walk away? His wife is your friend. His children played with our grandchildren. What would it solve to kill him, to make his family suffer for his mistakes? Vincent poured another scotch, offering one to Elena, who shook her head. The organization is stronger with him gone and discredited than with him dead and martyred. Elena sat down across from him, her anger slowly transforming into understanding. After 38 years of marriage to a mob boss, she understood the calculations, the compromises, the weight of decisions that affected dozens of families. What about Isabella? She abandoned her career to be here. Isabella will go back to California, back to her life, and hopefully never have to think about this business again, Vincent said firmly. That was always the plan. Keep our children away from this life. Let them be legitimate, clean. She doesn't need to know the details. But Isabella appeared in the doorway at that moment, her lawyer's mind having already pieced together much of the truth from overheard conversations and her father's suddenly healthy appearance. Too late for that, Dad. I want to know everything. Vincent looked at his daughter, seeing both his own determination and her mother's intelligence reflected in her eyes. She'd built a successful career prosecuting white-collar criminals in Los Angeles, intentionally choosing a path far from her father's world. Now she was demanding to understand that world, perhaps for the first time as an adult rather than a sheltered child. You really want to know? Vincent asked. Once you understand how things work, you can't unknow it. Your whole career is built on the law, Isabella. What I do exists in the shadows of that law. Isabella sat down, her posture straight, professional. Marco was going to kill you. That much I've figured out, and you faked being sick to expose him. But why let him live? In your world, betrayal means death. Everyone knows that. Vincent was impressed, despite himself. She'd grasped the core of it quickly. Because that rule, betrayal means death, it's simple, but simplicity doesn't always serve justice. Marco betrayed me out of greed, yes, but also out of fear that when I died naturally, someone else would be chosen over him. He acted out of insecurity, not pure malice, and his family is innocent. So you're showing mercy? Isabella's tone suggested she wasn't sure whether to be proud or concerned. I'm showing calculation, Vincent corrected. Mercy is a byproduct. The Colombo family backed Marco's play because they thought we were weak. If I kill Marco, I prove I'm still strong, but also that I'm predictable. By letting him live, I'm unpredictable, which is more dangerous. The Colombos will wonder what else I might do, what other rules I might break. It keeps them off balance. Tommy Russo appeared at the door, his phone in hand. Boss, we got a situation. Words spreading about Marco. Some of the younger guys in the crew are saying you're going soft, that in the old days, a traitor would be dead within the hour. Vincent had expected this. Set up a meeting tomorrow. All the soldiers, all the associates, everyone needs to hear this directly from me. The next morning, Vincent gathered his organization at a social club in Bensonhurst, a nondescript building that had served as neutral ground for family meetings for decades. Over 60 men crowded into the main room, ranging from old-timers who'd worked for Vincent's father to young guys barely in their 20s looking to prove themselves. Vincent stood at the front, commanding silence with just his presence. You've all heard about Marco by now. Some of you are saying I went soft, that a traitor should be dead. Let me explain something about leadership that some of you haven't learned yet. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the crowd. Killing is easy. Any idiot with a gun can pull a trigger. What's hard is building something that lasts, creating an organization that survives generations, making decisions that benefit the family long-term instead of just satisfying immediate anger. A young soldier named Danny Rizzo spoke up, his voice challenging. With respect, boss, in the old days are dead, Vincent interrupted. Half the families from the old days are in prison or destroyed by internal wars. We're still here because I'm willing to adapt, to think beyond tomorrow. Marco's alive because it serves us better than him being dead. The Colombos are backing off because they don't understand the move. and that uncertainty is more valuable than the temporary satisfaction of revenge. Sal Giordano stepped forward, adding his support. The boss is right. We've been more profitable and more secure in the last 15 years than any other family in New York. That's not luck, that's leadership. Vincent saw the shift in the room, the young hotheads slowly being convinced by the veteran captain's endorsement. But Danny Rizzo wasn't finished. So what stops the next guy from betraying you? If the punishment isn't death, what's the deterrent? It was a fair question, and Vincent had an answer ready. Marco's alive, but he's destroyed. Every dollar he stole is being recovered. His reputation is finished. No family will ever touch him again. He has to live knowing he threw away power, wealth, and respect because he couldn't wait a few more years. That's a special kind of hell, watching from the outside while the life he wanted goes to someone else. He walked closer to Danny, his voice dropping to a tone that carried more threat than any shouting could. And make no mistake, Marco got mercy because circumstances allowed it. The next person who betrays this family won't be so lucky. Now Marco's case sets an example of strategic thinking. The next case will set an example of what happens when mercy runs out. The meeting ended with renewed loyalty, the soldiers understanding that Vincent's decision came from strength, not weakness. As the crowd dispersed, Tommy Russo pulled Vincent aside. The Colombos called. They're willing to meet. They claim Marco approached them, not the other way around. They're lying, Vincent said flatly. But we'll pretend to believe them because it gives everyone an out. We maintain the peace, they stay out of our territories, and business continues. Frank DeLuca joined them. Boss, what about Marco's crew? His guys are nervous, don't know where they stand. Vincent had already thought through this problem. Marco's crew consisted of about 15 men who'd worked directly under him, handling various operations from loan sharking to labor racketeering. Some were loyal to Marco personally, others had simply been following orders. Sorting them out would take careful attention. Bring them in, one at a time. I want to talk to each of them personally. The ones who knew about the plot and stayed silent. They're out, no negotiations. The ones who were in the dark, who were just doing their jobs. We give them a chance to prove themselves under new management. Over the next week, Vincent conducted what felt like exit interviews at a legitimate corporation. Except the stakes involved loyalty to a criminal empire rather than quarterly profits. Most of Marco's crew had been ignorant of the betrayal, genuinely shocked when they learned what their boss had been planning. 2 soldiers, however, had known and said nothing, seeing which way the wind would blow before committing. Vincent dealt with them quietly. They were given the same choice Marco had received: disappear permanently or face consequences. Both chose to leave New York, their silence bought with the understanding that speaking about the family's business would be their last act on Earth. The reorganization took 3 weeks. Tommy, Sal, and Frank settled into their new roles as a leadership triumvirate, each man checking the other's ambitions through shared responsibility. The system wasn't perfect, but it was more resilient than the old structure. No single person could accumulate enough power to threaten Vincent's position again. Isabella stayed in New York longer than intended, fascinated despite herself by the machinery of her father's world. She sat through meetings where million-dollar deals were made with handshakes, where disputes were resolved through negotiation backed by the implicit threat of violence, where loyalty was currency and reputation was armor. "It's not what I expected," she admitted one evening over dinner at the Long Island estate. "I thought it would be more brutal, more obviously criminal." Vincent smiled. That's the point. The families that survive are the ones that operate like businesses first, criminals second. The brutality is there when needed, but it's the last resort, not the first option. We're not street thugs, Isabella. We're an organization that happens to operate outside the law. "But you're still criminals," Isabella said, not judgmentally, but as a statement of fact. Everything you do, from the unions to the gambling, it's illegal. Illegal and immoral aren't always the same thing, Vincent replied. The unions we control. They ensure workers get fair wages and safe conditions. The gambling. People are going to bet regardless. We just make sure it's organized and reliable. The construction kickbacks. They guarantee quality work and on-time completion. We provide services the legitimate world pretends don't exist. Elena, who'd been listening silently, finally spoke. Vincent, don't rationalize it to her. We both know what this life is. It's made us wealthy and powerful, but it's also made us complicit in things that keep me awake at night. The honesty silenced the table. After a moment, Vincent nodded. Your mother's right. I can justify the business decisions, explain the logic, but at the end of the day, we've built our life on breaking laws and sometimes breaking people. That's why I wanted you and your brother far from this world. Isabella's brother, Michael, had moved to Boston years ago, working as an investment banker with no connection to the family business. He'd made it clear he wanted nothing to do with organized crime, and Vincent had respected that choice, even though it meant one less child to eventually inherit the empire. What happens when you actually do get sick? Isabella asked. Or when you decide to retire? This triumvirate system only works because you're still the ultimate authority. When that changes, what stops it from falling apart? It was the question Vincent had been avoiding for years. He was 63 and healthy, but time was undefeated. Eventually, someone would have to take over, and the transition of power in organized crime families was historically where everything fell apart. I'm working on that, Vincent admitted. The triumvirate is step one, spreading power so no single person becomes indispensable. Step two is identifying someone from the next generation who can be groomed to take over, someone who can command respect from Tommy, Sal, and Frank. And step three? Isabella pressed. Step three is making the family legitimate, Vincent said quietly. Not overnight, but gradually, moving money from illegal operations into legal businesses. Real estate, restaurants, entertainment. Within 20 years, the Caruso family could be completely clean, our wealth laundered into respectability. Elena looked skeptical. You've been talking about going legitimate for 30 years, Vincent. It never happens. Because I never had the right reason before, Vincent countered. But seeing Marco's betrayal, seeing how fragile this whole structure is, seeing Isabella here, wanting to understand, but also wanting to stay away, it's made me realize we can't keep doing this forever. Either we evolve or we die. The conversation was interrupted by Tony Messina's urgent arrival. Boss, we got a problem. Marco's back. The room froze. Marco had been given 24 hours to disappear, and he'd taken his family to Florida, or so they'd thought. Now, 3 weeks later, he was back in New York, making the kind of mistake that forced Vincent's hand. Where? Vincent demanded. He's at his old house in Bay Ridge. Neighbors say he showed up this morning alone. His family's still in Florida. Vincent's expression hardened. Marco had been given mercy, given a chance to build a new life somewhere else. Coming back violated the agreement, forced Vincent to respond in a way that would satisfy the organization's expectations of justice. He came back to die, Tommy Russo said quietly. He must know that. Vincent stood up, the decision already made. I'll talk to him first. Maybe there's an explanation. Boss, don't, Frank DeLuca urged. This is a violation. Let us handle it. But Vincent shook his head. 15 years, Frank. I owe him a conversation before anything else. The drive to Bay Ridge took 40 minutes. Vincent sitting in the back of his car while Tony drove and 2 other soldiers followed in a second vehicle. The neighborhood was quiet. Working-class, Italian-American families who knew better than to notice when certain cars pulled up to certain houses. Marco was sitting on his porch, a bottle of whiskey beside him, looking like a man who'd already made peace with his fate. When he saw Vincent's car, he didn't run or reach for a weapon. He just waited. Vincent walked up the steps slowly, waving off his bodyguards. "You came back." "I couldn't do it," Marco said, his voice hollow. "I couldn't live somewhere else, pretending to be someone else. This is my city. These are my streets. I'd rather die here than live somewhere I don't belong." Vincent sat down beside him, two old friends on a porch they'd sat on hundreds of times before. "You know what this means. You know what I have to do now." "I know," Marco agreed, "and I'm ready. I just wanted to explain why, not to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. Just to explain." The October wind carried the smell of the nearby bay, mixing with the whiskey fumes and the weight of impending violence. Vincent listened as Marco talked about the fear that had driven his betrayal, fear of being forgotten, of being passed over, of dying in obscurity after spending his life building someone else's empire. "You were never going to be forgotten," Vincent said quietly. "You were my underboss. Your name would have been spoken with respect long after both of us were gone, but you couldn't see that. You couldn't trust that loyalty would be rewarded." "I know that now," Marco said. "Too late, but I know." Vincent stood up, his heart heavy with what came next. Marco had made his choice, coming back, refusing to accept mercy, forcing the situation to its inevitable conclusion. In some ways, it was an act of courage, accepting responsibility for his betrayal in the only way he knew how. "You got any last wishes?" Vincent asked. "Messages for your family?" Marco shook his head. "Just tell them I'm sorry, and that everything I did wrong was my choice, not theirs. They don't deserve to carry my shame." Vincent nodded to Tony, who'd been waiting at the bottom of the steps. What happened next was quick and professional. No drama, no grand speeches, just the cold reality of a broken covenant and the price that came with it. Marco closed his eyes, and it was over. The body would be found by police within hours, another mob killing in a city that had seen thousands of them. The press would speculate about gang wars and power struggles, but they'd miss the real story, a boss who tried to show mercy, and a man who couldn't accept it, couldn't live with the reality of his own cowardice. Isabella was waiting when Vincent returned to Long Island, her face pale. She knew what had happened without being told. "He came back?" "He couldn't run," Vincent confirmed. "Some men can't. They'd rather die in a world they understand than live in one where they're nobody." "Is this what you wanted?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling with anger or grief or both. "Another body, another funeral, another family destroyed?" Vincent poured himself a drink, his hands steady despite the weight of the evening. "What I wanted was for Marco to take the out I gave him, to disappear, to start over, to spend the rest of his life with his family far from this business. But he couldn't do it. And once he came back, once he violated the agreement, there was only one ending possible." He looked at his daughter, seeing the prosecutor in her struggling with the daughter, the woman of law, confronting the reality of her father's world. "This is why I wanted you away from this life, Isabella, because there are no perfect choices, no clean solutions. Every decision costs something, and you live with those costs forever." Eleanor appeared, taking Vincent's hand. "It's done now. Marco made his choice and you made yours. The only question is what happens next." What happened next was what always happened. The organization adapted, filled the vacuum, moved forward. Marco's death sent a clear message to anyone else considering betrayal. Mercy would be offered once, but not twice. The Colombo family sent a representative to Marco's funeral, a gesture of respect that also served as acknowledgement of the peace agreement holding between the families. Tommy, Sal, and Frank solidified their positions as the leadership triumvirate, their different management styles balancing each other out. Tommy's political connections kept law enforcement at bay. Sal's financial acumen kept the money flowing cleanly, and Frank's operational experience kept the day-to-day business running smoothly. Vincent spent the next months implementing his long-term plan for legitimacy, moving money gradually out of illegal operations and into legal businesses. It was a slow process, requiring patience and careful planning to avoid triggering law enforcement investigations. But it was happening finally, after decades of talking about it. Isabella returned to California, but something had changed. She called more frequently, asked more questions about the family business, expressed interest in helping with the legitimate operations. Vincent wasn't sure if this was growth or corruption, his daughter finally understanding his world or being drawn into it despite her intentions. On a cold December evening, 6 weeks after Marco's death, Vincent received an unexpected visitor. FBI agent Sarah Martinez had been investigating organized crime in New York for 15 years, and she'd been trying to build a case against Vincent for most of that time. Now she sat in his Long Island living room, drinking coffee and explaining why she was there. "Marco Benedetti's murder," she began, pulling out a file. "We know you ordered it. We know why. We even understand it, in the context of your world. But we can't prove it, and honestly, that's not why I'm here." Vincent waited, suspicious of this unusual approach. Federal agents didn't make social calls to acknowledge crimes they couldn't prove. "I'm here because we've noticed something interesting," Agent Martinez continued. "Over the past year, your organization's illegal activities have decreased by about 40%. Legitimate business investments have increased by 60%. You're transitioning out of organized crime." "That's an interesting theory," Vincent said carefully. "But I'm a retired businessman. I don't run any criminal organization." Agent Martinez smiled. "Right. And I'm here representing a tourist bureau instead of the FBI. Let's skip the denials. What I want to know is whether this transition is real. Because if it is, if you're genuinely moving toward legitimacy, then maybe we can work together instead of against each other." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "Work together? How?" "You provide information about other families, the ones still deep in illegal operations, human trafficking, drug distribution, the worst stuff. In exchange, we don't look too closely at how your legitimate businesses got their initial capital. We focus on real threats instead of chasing a 63-year-old man who's trying to go straight." It was a deal with the devil. Except Vincent wasn't sure who the devil was in this scenario. Cooperating with the FBI violated every code he'd lived by, but continuing to protect criminals who trafficked in drugs and human misery violated his sense of what the Caruso family had always stood for. "I need time to think about it," Vincent said finally. "You've got 48 hours, Agent Martinez replied, standing up. "After that, the offer expires and we go back to being enemies. But think about your grandchildren, Mr. Caruso. Think about what kind of legacy you want to leave them." After she left, Vincent sat in silence, weighing the impossible choice. Tommy, Sal, and Frank arrived within the hour, summoned for an emergency meeting. Vincent laid out Agent Martinez's proposal, watching their reactions carefully. "It's a trap," Tommy said immediately. "The FBI doesn't make deals with mob bosses. They're trying to turn you into an informant, and then they'll use that to destroy you and everyone around you." But Sal saw it differently. "Or maybe it's an opportunity. We've been talking about going legitimate for years. This could accelerate that timeline, give us protection while we transition." Najib Frank was the tiebreaker, his opinion carrying weight from decades of experience. "The question isn't whether the FBI is trustworthy. They're not. The question is whether we can use them the same way they want to use us. If we're strategic about what information we provide, we can eliminate our competition while strengthening our own position." Vincent listened to all three perspectives, each man representing a different aspect of the decision. This was exactly why the triumvirate system worked. No single viewpoint dominated, forcing him to consider every angle before deciding. "I'm going to meet with her again," Vincent announced. "But we're going to set terms. Specific targets only, nothing that implicates our organization or our allies. And everything we provide has to be intelligence they could have gotten elsewhere. We're just accelerating their investigations, not doing their job for them." Indeed, the decision set off a chain of events that would reshape New York's organized crime landscape over the next 2 years. The Caruso family became ghosts, gradually fading from FBI surveillance, while other families found themselves under intense prosecution. It looked like masterful evasion, but it was actually strategic cooperation. Vincent providing just enough information to satisfy Agent Martinez while protecting his own interests. Isabella became more involved in the family's legitimate businesses, her legal expertise proving invaluable as they navigated complex corporate structures and regulatory requirements. She never participated in any illegal activities, but she stopped pretending not to understand where the family's wealth originated. It was a compromise, like everything else in Vincent's world. Not pure, not clean, but honest in its own way. On a spring morning 2 years after Marco's betrayal, Vincent stood on his porch overlooking Long Island Sound, watching the sun rise over water that had witnessed a century of criminal enterprise. He was 65 now, still healthy but feeling the weight of time in ways he couldn't ignore. Elena joined him, her hand slipping into his. "You're thinking about retirement again." "I'm thinking about what comes next," Vincent corrected. "The family's mostly legitimate now. Another 5 years and we'll be completely clean. Someone else can run things then, someone who doesn't carry the weight of all the choices I made." "Tommy, Sal, or Frank?" Elena asked. Vincent shook his head. "None of them. They're perfect for managing the transition, but the next generation needs someone from outside the old world, someone who can lead a legitimate organization without the baggage of knowing where all the bodies are buried." He meant it literally and figuratively. Over 40 years in organized crime, Vincent had made decisions that resulted in deaths, imprisonments, destroyed lives. Those choices had been necessary, or at least unavoidable, but they weighed on him more as he aged. The chance to build something clean for his grandchildren that was worth more than all the power he'd accumulated. Agent Martinez's partnership had served its purpose. Several major criminal families had been dismantled through FBI prosecutions, their leaders imprisoned for decades on racketeering and conspiracy charges. The Caruso family's involvement remained hidden, their cooperation protected by the same confidential informant protocols that protected undercover agents. Vincent knew this made him a rat in the eyes of other mobsters, violated everything the old codes demanded. But those codes had been written in a different time, for a different world. The families that stuck rigidly to tradition were either extinct or dying. The ones that adapted, that recognized when circumstances demanded flexibility, they survived. On his 66th birthday, Vincent announced his retirement to the organization. Tommy, Sal, and Frank would continue leading the legitimate businesses, but Vincent was stepping away from all decision-making. He'd be available for advice, but the daily operations were now someone else's responsibility. The retirement party was held at Lombardi's, the same restaurant where Vincent had confronted Marco about the union negotiations years before. Nearly 200 people attended, legitimate businessmen, old associates from the criminal days who'd also transitioned out, family members spanning 3 generations. It was a celebration of survival, of a man who'd navigated the most dangerous business in America and lived to retire comfortably. Isabella gave a speech that made Vincent's eyes water. She talked about growing up afraid of what her father did, then understanding it, then finally respecting the complexity of his choices, even when she couldn't condone them. "My father built an empire," she said, "but his greatest accomplishment was having the wisdom to dismantle that empire and build something better in its place." As the party wound down and guests departed, Vincent found himself alone with Tommy, Sal, and Frank. The three men who'd helped him transform the Caruso family from a criminal organization into a legitimate enterprise. "You think it'll last?" Tommy asked. "Everything we built?" Vincent considered the question seriously. "The criminal empire? No, that was always temporary, built on sand. But the legitimate businesses, the wealth we've created, the lessons we've learned, that can last for generations. As long as future Carusos remember where they came from and why we changed." Sal raised his glass. "To Vincent Caruso, the boss who had the courage to stop being a boss." They drank to that, four old men who'd survived a world that killed most of its participants. The irony wasn't lost on Vincent. He'd started by faking terminal illness to expose betrayal and ended by actually stepping away from power, which in mob terms was a kind of death. But this death was chosen, controlled, peaceful. Marco's betrayal, as painful as it had been, had ultimately saved the family by forcing Vincent to confront the fragility of the old ways. The performance of dying had revealed who couldn't be trusted, but more importantly, it had shown Vincent his own mortality, the limited time available to make changes that mattered. 4 years after his retirement, Vincent received news that Marco's son, now 12 years old, had been accepted to a prestigious boarding school, his tuition paid by an anonymous donor. Vincent had arranged it through intermediaries, making sure Marco's family didn't suffer for his father's mistakes. It was a small gesture, but it represented the kind of mercy that defined Vincent's later years. Not mercy as weakness, but mercy as strategic humanity. Elena's health began failing when Vincent was 68, cancer that was real rather than performed. He cared for her with the same dedication he'd once applied to running a criminal empire, organizing the best doctors, creating comfortable spaces, spending hours just sitting with her as she fought the disease. Isabella flew in from California every weekend, and Michael came down from Boston. The family that Vincent had tried to protect from his criminal world now protected him from loneliness, supporting him through Elena's illness with the same strength he'd once shown them. Elena died on a Tuesday morning in September, surrounded by family, her hand in Vincent's. Her last words were about the life they'd built together, the good that had come from questionable choices, the love that had survived decades of stress and danger. Vincent held her until she was gone, then sat in silence as the reality of her absence settled over him. The funeral drew crowds from both legitimate society and the old world, politicians and priests, businessmen and former associates, people who'd known Vincent as a mob boss and people who only knew him as a philanthropist and businessman. It was a testament to the transition he'd managed, the dual legacy he'd created. In the months after Elena's death, Vincent withdrew from public life, spending time at the Long Island estate with his grandchildren, teaching them about family history in carefully edited versions that emphasized resilience and adaptation. He never lied to them, but he didn't burden them with details they didn't need to carry. Isabella's oldest son, Marco, named before the betrayal, the name kept despite it, showed an interest in the family's business history. At 13, he asked his grandfather direct questions about organized crime, about the choices that had been made, about the legacy Vincent had built and then dismantled. Vincent took him to the porch overlooking Long Island Sound, the same place where so many important conversations had happened. "Your grandmother and I built our life on broken rules," Vincent explained honestly. "We made choices that seemed necessary at the time, that provided for our family, that created the wealth you'll inherit. But those choices had costs. People died. Families were destroyed. Laws were broken. Young Marco listened intently, his eyes showing intelligence beyond his years. "But you changed. You made things legitimate." "I tried," Vincent agreed. "I realized that building something that lasts requires more than power and fear. It requires legitimacy, respect that's earned rather than taken. Your generation gets to start from that legitimate place, but only because my generation paid the price to get us there." "Was it worth it?" the boy asked. Vincent thought about Marco Benedetti dying on his porch, about Elena spending 38 years married to a criminal, about the fear he'd seen in Isabella's eyes when she finally understood what he'd done. "I don't know," he admitted. "I survived. I protected my family. They built wealth that will last for generations, but I also caused pain, made choices I can't undo, lived a life I can't fully defend. You'll have to decide for yourself whether it was worth it." It was the most honest answer Vincent had ever given, free from rationalizations and justifications. Young Marco absorbed it, and Vincent saw the moment when his grandson decided who he would be, not a criminal trying to go legitimate, but a legitimate person aware of where he came from. 5 years after Elena's death, Vincent suffered a stroke. It wasn't severe enough to kill him, but it left him weakened, reminding him that the performance of dying he'd staged years before would eventually become reality. He was 73, had lived longer than most men in his profession, and had achieved what few ever did, a peaceful retirement. Tommy, Sal, and Frank visited him in the hospital. The 3 men who'd helped transform the Caruso family, now old themselves, dealing with their own health issues and succession concerns. They talked about the business, about how the legitimate operations were thriving, about how completely they'd erased their criminal past. "We did it," Tommy said. "Everything you wanted to achieve. We did it." Vincent nodded from his hospital bed. "We survived. That was always the first goal. But we also became something better than what we started as. That's the real victory." Agent Martinez, now retired from the FBI, sent a card acknowledging their partnership and its results. The information Vincent had provided had dismantled multiple criminal organizations, prevented countless crimes, and made New York safer than it had been in decades. The cooperation had violated mob codes, but it had served a greater good. Proof that even in Vincent's world, redemption was possible. Isabella brought young Marco to visit, the teenager now preparing for college with plans to study business and eventually take over the family's legitimate operations. He sat with his grandfather, asking questions about leadership and decision-making, receiving wisdom earned through decades of navigating impossible choices. "The hardest decisions you'll make won't be between right and wrong," Vincent told him. "They'll be between wrong and wrong, or between what's right for different groups of people. That's when leadership matters, when there are no good options, only less bad ones." Vincent recovered from the stroke enough to return home, though he moved slowly and tired easily. He spent his days on the porch, watching the sound, thinking about the life he'd lived and the legacy he'd leave. The criminal empire was gone, dismantled by choice rather than prosecution. The legitimate businesses thrived, providing employment and opportunity for hundreds of families. His children and grandchildren were successful, educated, positioned for futures far removed from the violence that had defined his youth. On a quiet morning in late October, 7 years after Elena's death, Vincent Caruso died in his sleep. He was 75 years old, surrounded by photographs of his family, looking out over water that had witnessed his entire life story. The funeral was massive. Politicians gave speeches, priests offered prayers, and somewhere in the back, a handful of old men who'd known Vincent in his criminal days paid their respects silently. The press covered it as the death of a philanthropist and businessman, never mentioning the organized crime empire he'd once controlled. That history had been successfully buried, replaced by a cleaner narrative that served the family's legitimate interests. Isabella gave the eulogy, speaking honestly about her father's complexity, the criminal who became a legitimate businessman, the mob boss who chose mercy when violence was expected, the man who spent his last years trying to build something better than what he'd started with. She didn't glorify his criminal past, but she didn't demonize it either. She presented him as he was, a man of his time and circumstances who'd made difficult choices and lived with their consequences. "My father's greatest strength wasn't his power," Isabella concluded. "It was his willingness to give up that power when he recognized it was time for change. He built an empire and then voluntarily dismantled it, understanding that true legacy isn't about what you control, but what you create that continues after you're gone." Tommy, Sal, and Frank carried the casket. 3 old men honoring the boss who'd transformed their lives and given them a future beyond crime. The Caruso family continued, now completely legitimate, wealthy and respected, carrying Vincent's name forward into a future he'd worked hard to make possible. Young Marco, now 20 and studying business at Columbia University, understood that his grandfather's real gift wasn't the wealth he'd inherited, but the hard-won wisdom that came from a life lived between 2 worlds. The criminal empire was history, but the lessons from that history, about loyalty and betrayal, mercy and justice, power and responsibility, those lessons would guide the family for generations. The powerful mobster who'd faked illness to expose betrayal ended his life having achieved what few in his profession ever did: a peaceful death, a legitimate legacy, and a family prepared to carry his name forward without carrying his crimes. The performance of dying had revealed traitors and tested loyalty. The reality of dying revealed what truly mattered: not power or fear or control, but family, redemption, and the courage to change. Vincent Caruso's story wasn't a tale of a criminal who got away with his crimes. It was the story of a man who recognized the costs of his choices and spent his final years trying to minimize the damage, to create something better, to leave behind a legacy that his grandchildren could be proud of without having to make excuses. The betrayal that had started it all, Marco's coup attempt, the fake illness, the revelation that froze Vincent when he saw the evidence, all of it had been the catalyst for transformation. Without that moment of testing, Vincent might have continued as he always had, building criminal power until prosecutors or rivals ended him. Instead, he'd used that moment to begin the long process of change, of evolution, of choosing a different path. In the end, the most powerful move Vincent Caruso ever made wasn't ordering a hit or winning a territory war or building a criminal empire. It was having the wisdom to recognize when power had become a burden rather than a strength, and the courage to walk away from it. His tombstone was simple, bearing only his name and dates. No titles, no declarations of power, no claims of empire. Just Vincent Caruso, 1952-2027, husband, father, grandfather. The criminal who'd frozen when betrayal was revealed had spent the rest of his life ensuring that moment of weakness became a catalyst for strength, not the strength of violence and control, but the strength of transformation and redemption. The Caruso family continued without him, carrying his name into legitimate businesses that employed thousands, supported communities, and built wealth that would last for generations. They remembered him not as the mob boss who'd once controlled New York's underworld, but as the patriarch who'd had the courage to dismantle that empire and build something better in its place. Marco Benedetti's son, now a successful doctor in Miami, never learned the full truth about his father's betrayal or how close he'd come to losing everything. Vincent had made sure of that, providing for Marco's family anonymously, ensuring the children didn't pay for their father's mistakes. It was a final act of mercy, a demonstration that even in a world built on retribution, grace was possible. The powerful mobster who'd feigned illness had discovered something more valuable than any empire, the freedom that comes from letting go, the peace that follows redemption, and the legacy that survives when you choose to become something better than what you were.